At my husband's funeral, as my sister tried to steal his legacy with a secret child and a fake will, I did the unthinkable. I smiled. It wasn't madness born from grief. It was the calm of knowing the one medical secret that made her entire life biologically impossible. My name is Frances Preston, and for 20 years, I was married to the love of my life, Arthur. But this story isn't about our life together. It's about how it ended and the war that began the day we buried him. Picture this. The grand ballroom of our historic Charleston estate, smelling of lilies and old money. 200 of South Carolina's most influential people are murmuring condolences just feet away from my husband's portrait. The air is thick with grief. And then, my younger sister, Deborah, taps her glass for attention. With tears that looked real to everyone but me, she announced she was carrying a secret. She claimed her 1-year-old son, Kevin, wasn't just my nephew. He was Arthur's son, the hidden heir to the Preston shipping empire. Then came the final twist of the knife. She held up a will, crisp and official-looking, declaring that Arthur had left half of his $300 million fortune to his true son. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to me, the barren wife, the widow, suddenly disinherited. They expected me to shatter. But as I looked at my sister's triumphant face, a strange, cold smile touched my lips. She thought she had planned the perfect deception. She had no idea my husband had planned the perfect defense. If you have ever been underestimated in a moment of crisis, do me a favor and hit that like button to let me know I'm not alone. That smile wasn't one of happiness, or even insanity. It was the chilling calm of a queen who sees a traitor's move on a chessboard and already knows the checkmate is 10 moves away. While the guests whispered, dissecting my reaction, my mind was a fortress of clarity. Grief was a luxury I could no longer afford. Deborah wanted a war? Arthur had left me an arsenal. In that moment, I made a silent vow not just to Arthur's memory, but to myself. I would not just expose her lies. I would dismantle her life with the same meticulous, cold precision she used to try and destroy mine. This wouldn't be a screaming match in the parlor, the kind of messy drama my sister loved. This was going to be a quiet, systematic execution of justice. I turned, my back straight, and walked out of that ballroom without a single word. I could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on me, their pity and morbid curiosity burning into my black dress. I let them stare. They were seeing a victim. I was feeling like a soldier. Family revenge stories aren't always loud and explosive. Sometimes they are silent, waged in the shadows of law offices and bank vaults, and the victory is a quiet click of a lockbox opening to reveal the truth. If you've ever felt that silent strength rising up when the world expected you to fall, just type the city you're watching from in the comments. Let's see how far this invisible army of survivors reaches. To understand the war, you first have to understand the kingdom Arthur and I built together. We didn't meet at some college party. We met under the grand rotunda of the Charleston City Hall during a fundraiser to preserve its historic architecture. He wasn't the loudest man in the room, but he was the one everyone watched. Arthur Preston had inherited a shipping legacy, but he had the mind of a master strategist, seeing global trade routes on a napkin sketch where others saw only numbers on a spreadsheet. Our first date was a walk along the Battery, the sea breeze thick with the scent of salt and sweetgrass. He didn't talk about his fortune. He talked about the history of the houses, the ambition of the men who built them, and his dream of creating a legacy that would outlast the stone walls around us. I fell in love with his mind before I ever saw the inside of the Preston building. He saw me not as an accessory, but as his equal, his most trusted counsel. In the boardroom, he was the king, but in our library at night, reviewing contracts and expansion plans, we were a dynasty of two. He valued my intuition, my ability to read the people behind the proposals. "You see the heart of the matter, Frances," he'd say, while I just see the path. Our marriage was a fortress built on mutual respect and a deep, quiet love. A fortress Deborah was now trying to burn to the ground with a lie. She wasn't just attacking me, she was trying to desecrate the very foundation of the kingdom we had so carefully built. But every fortress, no matter how grand, has a hollow chamber. Our kingdom had everything: wealth, power, respect, and a deep love. Everything, except an heir. For years, We waged a quiet war against biology. Our calendars, once filled with galas and board meetings, became a grid of appointments in sterile clinics. Our conversations filled with medical terms that felt alien and cold. Each month was a cycle of desperate hope followed by a quiet, crushing disappointment. In a city like Charleston, where family lines stretch back for centuries, the pressure was immense. It was a constant, unspoken question in the eyes of Arthur's extended family. We were the king and queen of a magnificent kingdom, with no prince or princess to inherit it. That struggle could have shattered us. Instead, it fused us together. I'll never forget the evening after our last failed attempt. We were sitting on the piazza, watching the fireflies dance over the lawn. I felt like a failure, like I had let him and his entire lineage down. He took my hand and said, "Francis, the Preston legacy isn't about blood. It's about what we build. And you and I, together, are more of a legacy than any child could ever be." He meant it. That's the man he was. Which is why Deborah's lie was so monstrously clever. She didn't just invent an affair, she took our deepest, most private pain and fashioned it into a public weapon. Let me know in the comments. Were you ever the scapegoat in your family? Type savior if you were always the fixer, or star if you were always the golden child. I really want to see the balance. So, the question is, why? Why would a sister inflict such a calculated, cruel wound? To understand Deborah, you have to understand the oppressive humidity of a Southern childhood. I was the responsible one, the one with the good grades and the steady plans. Deborah was the beautiful one. She was born with a charm that could coax the moon from the sky, a dazzling smile that made everyone forgive her transgressions. Our parents weren't malicious, but they were enchanted. They saw her beauty and my reliability not as different traits, but as a system of balance. I was the anchor. She was the sail. For years, I was the fixer, the one who quietly paid her overdue rent or made excuses for her latest failed venture. She wore her beauty like a currency she thought would never devalue. But beneath the charm, a bitter envy took root. She didn't just want the things I had, she resented that I had earned them. When I married Arthur, it was the ultimate injustice in her eyes. It wasn't that she loved him, it was that he was the one prize her charm couldn't win. She saw our life not as something we built, but as a lottery I had unfairly won. She saw the Preston estate, the respect, the power, as things that should have been hers by right of her beauty. I see it so clearly now. Her betrayal wasn't a sudden crack in her character. It was the final, desperate act of a lifetime spent in a beautiful, gilded cage of her own making, rattling the bars and screaming that someone else had the life she was owed. That quiet resentment began to boil over in the last year of Arthur's life. Deborah's attempts to undermine me became more brazen. She would show up at the Preston building, unannounced, dressed for a lunch she hadn't been invited to, only for Arthur to have his assistant politely send her away. He saw her for exactly what she was. I remember one evening, he came home looking troubled after a tense family dinner, where Deborah had made a thinly veiled joke about his work ethic. "She's not just envious anymore, Francis," he told me, his voice low. "She's becoming reckless." It was then he started having more frequent, private meetings with Walter, our family attorney. At the time, I thought he was simply updating our estate planning. In retrospect, I see he was fortifying our kingdom's walls against an internal threat. Then came that day in May. The sky was a perfect, cloudless blue, the kind of day Arthur lived for out on the water. He was an expert sailor. He'd navigated the Charleston harbor since he was a boy. His boat, the Francis, was a 60-foot marvel of engineering. The official report said a sudden, violent squall appeared out of nowhere, capsizing the vessel. A freak accident. But the story never sat right with me. A veteran captain, a state-of-the-art boat, and a storm that no other vessel in the harbor reported. It all felt too neat, too convenient. When Deborah stood before our grieving family and produced that forged will, a horrifying thought crystallized in my mind. This wasn't an act of spontaneous greed. This was the final move in a game she had been playing while Arthur was still alive. Let's go back to that ballroom, to the moment the world stopped spinning. When Deborah held up that fraudulent will, the sound in the room was deafening silence. I heard a single champagne flute shatter somewhere behind me. I saw the faces of Arthur's oldest business partners, men who had known him since he was a boy, morph from sympathy to suspicion. They were calculating risk, reevaluating the stability of the Preston empire right before my eyes. But the deepest cut didn't come from them. It came from my own parents. They stood frozen near the fireplace, my mother clutching my father's arm. I saw the blood drain from their faces, but I didn't see outrage on my behalf. I saw fear. Fear of a scandal. My mother's eyes darted towards me, pleading, not with Deborah to stop, but with me to not make a scene. My father, a man who always preached about honor, simply wrung his hands. In that moment of profound public humiliation, they didn't rush to my side. They didn't defend Arthur's memory. Their first instinct was to contain the damage, to smooth over the ugliest family crisis imaginable. Deborah knew they would do this. She counted on it. She knew they had spent a lifetime making excuses for her, and they wouldn't stop now. I was utterly alone, a queen abandoned by her own court. Have you ever been in a situation where the people who were supposed to be your protectors just stood there? If you had to learn how to be your own hero, type "I am my own hero" in the comments below. The silence from my parents that day was just the opening act. The true social execution happened in the days that followed, and it was swift and bloodless. In Charleston, reputation is the oldest and most valuable currency, and my sister had just declared ours bankrupt. The first to fall away were the friends, the wives of Arthur's business associates. The weekly brunch invitations stopped. My calls to the head of the museum's charity board, a board I had co-chaired for a decade, went unreturned, followed by a sterile email explaining my sabbatical was being made permanent. Then came the whispers. A trip to the Harris Teeter for groceries felt like walking a gauntlet. Women I had known my whole life would see me in an aisle, their eyes would widen, and they'd quickly steer their carts in the opposite direction. I became a ghost in my own city. The Grand Preston estate, once a hub of social life, became a silent mausoleum. The silence was the worst part. It was a constant reminder that Deborah's lie had been more powerful than 2 decades of my truth. She hadn't just slandered Arthur. She had successfully painted me as either a fool who had been deceived for years or a liar complicit in hiding a secret. Either way, I was tainted. I was a scandal. And in the manicured gardens of high society, scandals are weeds to be pulled up and discarded without a second thought. It was in that profound isolation, sitting alone in Arthur's vast library, that I realized a crucial truth. They had all left me for dead. And there is nothing more dangerous than a woman who has already lost everything. The morning the city officially turned its back on me, I didn't weep. I put on my pearls, a black Chanel suit that felt like armor, and drove my car downtown to Walter's office on Meeting Street. His office was a sanctuary of old leather and even older law books, a place where truth was measured in facts, not whispers. Walter, a man whose loyalty to the Preston family was as solid as the building's foundation, listened without interruption as I recounted the entire nightmarish week. His face was grim, but his eyes held no pity, only a quiet, simmering anger on my behalf. When I finished, he didn't offer empty comforts. He simply stood up, walked over to a formidable safe behind his desk, and retrieved a thick, sealed envelope. Arthur was a brilliant strategist. "Francis," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. He always planned for every contingency, even the unthinkable. He slid the documents across his mahogany desk. They were medical records from a private clinic, dated 3 years prior. The clinical language was cold, but to me, it was the most beautiful poetry I had ever read. A successful bilateral vasectomy, post-operative analysis confirming what Arthur and I had accepted as our private reality. It was biologically impossible for him to father a child. My breath caught in my throat. It was the first piece of the arsenal. The first irrefutable, undeniable truth. Arthur hadn't just loved me. He had anticipated the war and had laid the first stone for my fortress. The world may never know the private battles you've been through, but we do. Subscribe if these stories speak your truth. The medical records were a shield, but Walter and I knew it wasn't enough. To win a war, you don't just defend, you attack. "This proves the child isn't his, Francis," Walter said, his fingers steepled. But a forgery of a multi-million-dollar, will this sophisticated? Your sister is impulsive, but she's not this meticulous. She had help. That's when he recommended Mitch, a private investigator who had retired from the Charleston PD and knew where all the high society skeletons were buried. Mitch was a bulldog of a man who cared more about facts than family names. I gave him a blank check. Within a week, he delivered. The first file detailed Deborah's finances. She was drowning in over $1 million of debt, mostly from high-stakes online gambling. Her motive wasn't just envy, it was pure desperation. But the second file was the one that made my blood run cold. Mitch had traced the creation of the forged legal documents to a shady firm specializing in such things. The payment hadn't come from Deborah's empty bank account. It came from an offshore account belonging to a man we had trusted for 30 years, Mr. Abernathy, the chief financial officer of the Preston Empire. Mitch had even recovered encrypted emails between them. It all became sickeningly clear. 2 months before the boating accident, Arthur had initiated a quiet internal audit. He discovered Abernathy had been embezzling funds for years and was preparing to have him arrested. This wasn't just my sister's greedy plan. This was a full-blown conspiracy. A desperate attempt by 2 criminals to silence Arthur and seize his kingdom before they were exposed. The betrayal was deeper and darker than I could have ever imagined. I thought the revelation about Abernathy was the final floor of this hellish labyrinth, but Walter held up a hand. "There's one more thing," he said grimly. After Arthur confirmed the embezzlement, he knew he was dealing with a cornered animal. He came here and did something unorthodox. Walter turned the large monitor on his desk towards me and clicked on a single video file labeled simply, "For Francis." And then, he was there. My Arthur. Not a faded photograph, but alive, breathing, sitting in his leather chair in his study, looking directly into the camera with those steady blue eyes. He looked directly at me. "My dearest Francis." His voice filled the silent office, as warm and real as if he were sitting beside me. "If you are watching this, it means my fears were realized. But do not grieve for me now. Now, we fight." For the next 15 minutes, my brilliant, methodical husband laid out the entire case from beyond the grave. He detailed Abernathy's theft with account numbers and dates. He spoke of his concern over Deborah's escalating instability. He calmly and clearly stated for the record that he'd had a vasectomy 3 years ago and could not father a child. He ended by looking straight into the camera, into my soul, and said, "The Preston Empire is not in the ships or the buildings. It was always in you. Protect our legacy. Protect yourself." Tears streamed down my face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of awe. He had given me the ultimate weapon, his own voice. The truth, undeniable and eternal. If you have ever had to fight for the honor of someone you love, or for your own worth against those who would tear it down, this space is for you. Subscribe and join others who know that true power is speaking the truth, even when your voice shakes. With Arthur's voice as my guide and a mountain of evidence in hand, I could have ended it cleanly in a courtroom. But a quiet legal victory felt hollow. It wouldn't erase the whispers or the looks of pity. It wouldn't undo the public spectacle my sister had created. I didn't just want justice. I wanted capitulation. I wanted the entire city of Charleston, the same people who had so quickly cast me out, to witness their downfall. So, with Walter's help, we set a trap. A classic misinformation play. Walter placed a carefully orchestrated call to another prominent attorney, a man known less for his legal skills and more for his love of gossip. He let it slip that I was an emotional wreck, on the verge of a complete breakdown, and was preparing to offer Deborah a massive $200 million settlement just to make the scandal disappear. We knew the news would get back to her within the hour. The bait was set. Mitch's surveillance team confirmed they took it hook, line, and sinker. That very night, Deborah and Abernathy were photographed celebrating at Hall's Chop House, toasting their imminent victory. Their arrogance, fueled by greed, made them careless. Believing the massive payday was just days away, Abernathy got impatient. He made his final, fatal mistake. He formally submitted the forged will to the board of a secondary trust fund, attempting to liquidate a smaller $10 million account immediately. He thought it was a simple formality. He didn't know that Mitch, tipped off by us, had an associate on that very board, documenting the entire fraudulent attempt. It was the last piece I needed. They had moved from a conspiracy to an active, undeniable criminal act. The lions had strutted confidently into the cage, and the lock had just clicked shut behind them. With the final piece of evidence secured, it was time to choose the stage for my final act. 3 months after the funeral, I hosted the first annual Arthur Preston Memorial Gala, a fundraiser for maritime preservation. The invitation list was a carbon copy of the guest list from that horrific day at the estate. Every person who had whispered, judged, and abandoned me was there, dressed in their finest, sipping champagne. Deborah and Abernathy were seated at a prominent table, looking smug and victorious, no doubt believing this was my pathetic farewell to Charleston society. After the opening remarks, I took the stage, the spotlight warm on my face. I spoke of Arthur's integrity, his honor, and his belief in the truth. But a legacy of integrity, I said, my voice ringing through the silent ballroom, can only be maintained when the truth is brought into the light. And tonight, I've decided to let Arthur speak for himself. I nodded to the technician. The massive screens on either side of the stage flickered to life, and Arthur's face, strong and clear, filled the room. The gasps were audible as his recorded voice echoed through the hall, calmly detailing the conspiracy. I let his testimony hang in the air for a moment before the next slide appeared, the forged will next to the real one. Then, the surveillance photos of Deborah and Abernathy celebrating. And finally, the signed affidavit from the bank board detailing Abernathy's recent fraud attempt. As Deborah's face collapsed in horror, 2 discreet men in suits approached her table. Justice, like charity, I said into the microphone, is best served publicly. If this story just hit you right in the chest, do me a favor and hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that stories about truth and justice matter, and it tells me that I'm not alone in this fight. 1 year to the day after the gala, I wasn't wearing a black dress of mourning or a glittering gown of revenge. I was wearing a steel gray power suit, sitting at the head of the massive oak table in the Preston Building's boardroom. It was Arthur's chair, but I had long since stopped thinking of it that way. It was mine now. The first thing I did after the scandal broke was clean house. Every board member, every executive who had shown a moment's hesitation in their loyalty was politely, but firmly, shown the door. The whispers of Charleston society had turned from gossip about my supposed weakness to awe at my ruthlessness. I didn't care. I replaced them not with sycophants, but with talent-sharp, hungry minds who were loyal to the company's future, not its past. I didn't just save the Preston empire. I remade it in my own image. I sold the family estate, that beautiful mausoleum of memories and betrayal, and used the funds to establish a foundation in Arthur's name that provides scholarships for underprivileged students. The people who once shunned me at the grocery store now vied for invitations to my charity events. I accepted their donations, but offered them none of my time. My circle was smaller now, forged in loyalty, not social convenience. They had called me a grieving widow, a victim, a woman scorned. Now, when they spoke my name, they used only one word: Matriarch. I hadn't just reclaimed my husband's legacy. I had become the architect of my own. It's strange, the things that betrayal burns away. It took my sister, my trust in my own parents, and the comfortable innocence I had worn for 50 years. But in the ashes of that old life, I found a strength I never knew I possessed. People might watch this and call it one of those satisfying family revenge stories. But in my heart, I know it wasn't about revenge. Revenge is a hot, messy fire that consumes you. What I did was colder, cleaner. It was about restoring order to a universe that had been thrown into chaos by a lie. It was about honoring the truth of the life Arthur and I built. Deborah took a plea deal for fraud and conspiracy. She's serving a 3-year sentence in a low-security facility upstate. Abernathy, given his larger crimes, will be in federal prison for the better part of a decade. My parents visit her. I do not. Not out of hatred, but because I've learned that a boundary is not a wall to keep others out. It's a line to protect the peace you've fought to build inside yourself. I had spent my life as a partner, a wife, a member of a dynasty. It took losing all of that to finally meet the woman I was meant to become. A founder, a leader, an architect of my own destiny. The ultimate victory wasn't watching my enemies fall. It was the quiet realization, in the stillness of my new life, that I had the strength to rise on my own. So what is the lesson in all this wreckage and rebuilding? I've learned that family is a title that must be earned, not just inherited by blood. It is defined by who rushes to your side when the world turns against you, not by who shares your name. I've learned that justice and karma are not mystical forces. They are simply the inevitable outcomes of our own choices. Deborah's greed was the ink that signed her own conviction. Her actions set in motion a chain of events that led directly to her own cage. That is not my revenge. That is her creation. And I've learned the most difficult lesson of all: forgiveness. For a long time, I thought forgiveness was for her, an absolution I wasn't willing to grant. But I was wrong. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting the wound or pretending the scar isn't there. It is the quiet, personal act of deciding that you will no longer allow that wound to define you. My forgiveness was in turning off the recorder, in selling the estate, in building a new life where her memory held no power. I forgave her not to set her free, but to set myself free. The truth is, the greatest betrayals often come to teach us our most important lesson: that your own integrity is your only true sanctuary. You are the architect of your own peace, the guardian of your own worth. The storm may destroy your home, but it cannot touch the foundation upon which you will rebuild. If you believe in the power of rewriting your own story after the storm, in the quiet dignity of building a life based on your own truth, then subscribe and join this community. Together, we can share the stories of our foundations. Thank you for listening.